The trauma bay at Redstone Regional Medical Center had seen bad nights before, but nothing like this one. 18 vehicles, a mountain highway collapse, bodies arriving faster than anyone could count. And in the middle of it all, a nurse nobody had ever bothered to remember was standing over a man the doctors had already written off, watching his chest rise wrong, watching the color drain from his face in a pattern she hadn't seen since a forward operating base outside a desert city she wasn't allowed to name. She pressed 2 fingers against his neck and felt what machines hadn't caught. Then he opened his eyes, barely, and said one word. One impossible classified word that should not have existed in any civilian mouth in any American hospital. And Nurse Claire Donovan's entire carefully constructed life cracked straight down the middle. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now because the story you're about to hear is exactly the kind we tell on this channel. The ones that make your jaw drop, that keep you up at night, that remind you how much is hiding behind the people everyone ignores. Like this video, and drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Claire Donovan woke up at 4:47 in the morning the way she always did. Not to an alarm, but to a habit her body hadn't unlearned in 8 years of trying. She lay still for exactly 4 seconds, cataloged the sounds in the room, then sat up. Civilian life had softened the edges of a lot of things. That particular instinct wasn't one of them. Her apartment in Ashbrook was small and functional in a way that people who visited once never came back to comment on. 2 rooms. No art on the walls except a topographic map of a mountain range she'd trained in once. A bookshelf with more medical manuals than anything else, and a single framed photograph she kept face down on the top shelf. She'd moved it there the first week she arrived in Colorado and hadn't touched it since. She made coffee in the dark, drank it standing at the kitchen window, and watched the first pale edge of winter light come over the Rockies. Ashbrook sat at the base of a long valley between 2 ridgelines, a mid-sized Colorado city that had grown fast in the last decade. Tech money, tourism, a hospital expansion that the local paper had called a regional medical landmark. Redstone Regional Medical Center had added 2 floors, a new trauma wing, and a public relations department with more staff than its psychiatry unit. What it had not added was any particular interest in the nurses who kept it running. Claire pulled on her scrubs, checked her watch, and left. The drive took 11 minutes. She knew every traffic light, knew which entrance had the best parking at this hour, knew exactly how long it took to change out of her coat and into her badge lanyard before the morning supervisor started her clipboard rounds. 3 years of the same route. 3 years of knowing exactly where she fit in the building's invisible hierarchy, which was nowhere that mattered. She was a floor nurse. 4th floor, general medical surgical. She changed dressings, managed post-op patients, monitored vitals, administered medications, and filled out more paperwork than any single human being should be required to produce in 1 calendar year. She was reliable. She was competent. She was, as far as anyone on the administrative side of Redstone Regional was concerned, unremarkable in every way that counted toward advancement. Dr. Miles Grayson had made sure of that. She ran into him in the hallway outside the nursing station at 6:03 a.m., which was earlier than his usual rotation, but not unusual for a trauma attending, who liked people to see how dedicated he was. He was tall in that particular way that certain men use as a management strategy. Always positioned slightly above eye level, always angled toward the door he'd just come through. He was 44, broad-shouldered, and had the easy confidence of someone who had never once in his adult life been told that his instincts were wrong. Donovan. He didn't stop walking. Patient in 412 is requesting a medication review. I've already signed off on the chart, but someone flagged a dosage concern in the notes. Handle it. He tapped the side of his clipboard as he passed. And we've got new admits stacking up from overnight. I need those intake forms completed before 7. Dr. Grayson. She turned. The dosage flag on 412. Is that the metoprolol adjustment from yesterday? Because the patient's blood pressure has been running low since the switch, and Donovan. He had already stopped, but his tone hadn't. It was the particular pause of a man who has heard something he considers below his threshold of engagement. I said I signed off on the chart. That means I reviewed it. That means we're done here. She held the look for 1 second, then she nodded and went to handle it. She pulled the chart on 412 herself, cross-referenced the medication history, and quietly asked the attending pharmacist, not Grayson, never Grayson, to flag the interaction she'd identified between the adjusted metoprolol and the patient's existing diuretic regimen. The pharmacist looked at it for 30 seconds and said, "Yeah, this needs to change." They adjusted it together. The patient's blood pressure stabilized before noon. Nobody told Grayson. Nobody told Claire she'd done something worth noting. The chart was updated and the day moved on. This was what 3 years at Redstone Regional looked like for Claire Donovan. Not dramatic, not even particularly unfair by the standards of institutional medicine, just the slow, grinding accumulation of being useful and invisible at the same time. She had applied twice for a charge nurse position. She had been passed over twice, both times in favor of nurses with fewer years of experience, but with the right attending physicians writing their recommendations. She had submitted a formal proposal for a post-operative monitoring protocol in the cardiac unit. The proposal had been accepted, implemented, and credited to the department head in the internal newsletter. Her name appeared in the acknowledgments in the same font as the catering company for the rollout breakfast. She had stopped expecting anything to be different. That wasn't resignation, it was just clarity. She knew what she was here for. She knew what she could do within the limits she'd been assigned. And she had spent 8 years learning that survival sometimes meant working inside a structure that wasn't built for you, and doing it well enough that the structure didn't notice you were doing it at all. The night of November 14th changed that calculation in ways she had not planned for. The call came in at 9:22 p.m., a multi-vehicle accident on Route 7 at the Devil's Bend stretch of the highway above the valley, where the guardrails ended and the drop-off began. 18 vehicles involved. A transport truck had lost control on ice, taken out 4 cars, triggered a chain reaction that had pulled 3 more vehicles off the road, and sent at least 1 over the embankment. By the time the first ambulances reached Redstone Regional, the hospital's emergency department had already activated its mass casualty protocol, and the overhead system was calling every available physician and surgical nurse to the trauma wing. Claire was on hour 10 of a 12-hour shift and had been about to start her final medication rounds on the 4th floor when the announcement pulled her downstairs. She wasn't trauma bay certified. Grayson had blocked her last recertification request, citing staffing workflow concerns, which meant she was technically assigned to triage support and overflow. In practice, that meant she was working the hallway staging area outside the main trauma rooms, managing patients who had been assessed, stabilized to a threshold, and parked until a bed opened up. The hallway was organized chaos. 14 patients on gurneys, 2 additional arrivals coming in behind the first wave, nurses and techs moving fast between them, calling vitals across the corridor noise, IV lines being run, blood pressure cuffs cycling. Claire worked her way down the row with a clipboard, cross-checking monitors, flagging anything that had changed since initial triage. She was good at this. She was good at finding the things that shifted quietly while everyone was looking somewhere louder. She almost missed him. Bay Position 11 was a man in his mid-40s, listed on the triage sheet as John Hartwell, male, 46, blunt force trauma to the thorax and left arm, assessed as stable low priority following initial scan and chest x-ray. He had no ID on him, common in crash situations, and the name on the sheet had been given verbally by a paramedic at the scene who'd pulled it from a wallet that was subsequently lost in the wreckage. His blood pressure was 108/70. His O2 sat was 94. Borderline, but not enough to put him at the front of the queue in a night like this one, where the rooms were full of people in much worse condition. Claire stopped at his gurney. She wasn't sure why exactly. His monitor numbers were acceptable. His breathing rate was within range. But something in the way he was breathing didn't match those numbers. A rhythm that was too controlled, too deliberate. The way someone breathes when they're managing pain at a level most people can't manage, which meant they'd trained to. And there was something about the pattern of bruising visible above the edge of his hospital gown that wasn't consistent with a car accident. Blunt thoracic trauma from a seatbelt or steering column presented differently. This was different. This was concentrated, bilateral, and patterned in a way that she had seen before in a context that had nothing to do with any highway in Colorado. She leaned closer, his eyes opened. Not the glassy, unfocused drift of a concussed patient. They opened with the complete, immediate awareness of a man who had been conscious and watchful the entire time. He looked at her for 2 seconds. Then he said it. Sentinel. One word, barely a sound, but Claire heard it as clearly as if he'd shouted it across a silent room. She kept her face still. It took effort. She straightened, looked at the monitor, made a mark on the clipboard, and said, very quietly, without looking at him, "Stay still. I'm going to look at your chart." She walked to the nursing station, pulled his chart, and stood with it for 45 seconds, reading nothing and thinking very fast. Sentinel was not a word that should exist in any civilian's vocabulary, not in the context in which he'd used it, not with that particular cadence and that particular intent. It was a code indicator, a specific one, used within a specific tier of military medical coordination that the public had no knowledge of and no reason to. She had last heard it used in a field hospital tent in a location whose name she was contractually prohibited from speaking to anyone without a corresponding clearance level. She put the chart down and went back to him. "Sir." She kept her voice at a register that wouldn't carry over the ambient noise of the hallway. "I need to ask you a few questions about your breathing." "I'm fine," he said. His voice was steady, but the effort behind it was audible if you knew what to listen for. "You're not." She checked the position of the nurses nearest to them. Both were occupied, backs turned. "Your chest expansion on the left side is reduced by about 30%. Your breathing is compensated, controlled, voluntary. That's not what 94% O2 stable looks like. That's what a left-sided injury looks like when someone's working very hard not to show it." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "You're a nurse." "I am." "In this hospital?" "Yes." Another pause. He looked at the ceiling, then back at her. "How long?" 3 years? Before that? She held his gaze. 73rd Field Hospital, 2 tours. And before that, a unit that didn't have a name on any public record. Something shifted in his expression. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated and more careful than relief. "I need imaging," he said, left lateral chest. "And I need you not to—" "I know," she said. "Stay still." She went directly to the attending on duty in the hallway overflow, Dr. Priya Solan, a hospitalist she trusted, and requested an emergent left lateral chest film on the patient in Bay 11, citing reduced breath sounds and suspected hemothorax. Priya looked at the chart. "He's listed as stable. He's compensating. His breathing pattern is inconsistent with the initial assessment." Priya glanced toward the trauma rooms. Grayson was visible through the glass, gesturing at a monitor. Grayson cleared the triage list. Grayson didn't listen to his chest. A beat. Priya took the chart, looked at it for 5 seconds, and said, "Order the imaging." The portable X-ray arrived 12 minutes later. The tech took the films. Claire stood at the light panel in the nursing station 3 minutes after that and looked at what she already knew she would find. Left hemothorax, significant. The blood accumulation in the pleural cavity had been building, hidden beneath the compensated breathing and the borderline acceptable numbers. And it was now at a volume that put the patient 30 to 40 minutes from cardiovascular compromise, meaning 30 to 40 minutes from a collapse that, in a hallway staging area during a mass casualty event, he likely wouldn't survive in time. She went straight to Priya. "He needs a chest tube, now. Left side, 4th intercostal, mid-axillary. He's got significant hemothorax. He's been masking it." Priya looked at the film. Her jaw tightened. "Get Grayson." "Grayson will delay this." "Claire." "Priya." She kept her voice flat and certain. "I have seen this injury before, not in a textbook. I have seen it in the field, in people who are trained to conceal how badly they're hurt, because in certain environments, showing weakness gets you killed. He is going to crash within the hour if we don't go in now. If I'm wrong, you lose 40 minutes of my credibility. If you're wrong, you lose a patient." Priya stared at her for 2 full seconds. "Set up the tray," she said. The chest tube procedure took 9 minutes. Claire assisted. When the drainage tube was placed and the blood began to evacuate the cavity, 600 cc in the first 3 minutes, dark and fast, Priya exhaled through her nose and didn't say anything for a moment. "That would have killed him," she said finally. "Yes." "How did you—" "I'll write it up in the notes," Claire said. "All of it." She went back to the nursing station to document. She was 12 minutes into charting when Dr. Grayson appeared beside her. She heard him before she saw him. The particular sound of his footsteps, the weight and rhythm of someone who moves through spaces as if they owe him. She kept her eyes on the screen. Donovan. His voice was quiet and contained in the way that meant it was going to be significantly less quiet in a moment. Would you like to explain to me why a patient on the cleared triage list just went to emergency chest intervention based on an order you requested through a hospitalist, bypassing the trauma attending on duty? The patient had a missed hemothorax, she said. I identified it, confirmed it with imaging, and the attending reviewed the film before proceeding. The attending. He said the word the way people say the word when they mean to say something else. You mean you went around me? I went to the physician available to review the imaging. I am the trauma attending tonight, Donovan. That means any emergent decision in this department goes through me. She turned and looked at him. She was tired. She had been on shift for 11 hours, and she had just watched 600 cc of blood evacuate from a man's chest cavity, and she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Dr. Grayson, with the greatest respect for your position, she paused, just long enough to let that clause land. The patient had approximately 30 minutes before cardiovascular compromise. I made the most efficient clinical decision available given the time constraint and the staffing situation in the department tonight. The patient is stable. His face did something complicated. You're a floor nurse. Yes. You are not authorized to direct trauma-level clinical decisions. I requested imaging. A licensed physician reviewed it and ordered the procedure. That's not how this works. The patient is alive, she said. I think that's how this works. She turned back to the screen. He stood there for 3 more seconds. Then he said very quietly, We'll discuss this in the morning. She documented everything, every observation, every clinical indicator, every step of the decision chain. She wrote it cleanly and completely and flagged it for the hospitalist's co-signature. She finished her shift at 7:15 a.m., stayed an additional 40 minutes to brief the incoming charge nurse, and drove home in a pale gray morning, eyes dry and hands steady on the wheel. She did not know what had been found in the wreckage of the vehicles on Devil's Bend. She did not know that the patient in Bay 11, the man who had whispered a word she wasn't supposed to know, had not been traveling alone. She did not know that the crash had not been an accident, that the vehicle he'd been transported in had been identified at the scene by a federal highway investigator who had made a phone call within the first hour that had set in motion something much larger than a hospital protocol review. She only knew that she was exhausted and that the man was breathing and that Grayson was going to make her morning difficult. She was right about all three. The next morning's meeting was not in a conference room. It was in the office of Hospital Administrator Sandra Voss, a woman who had the particular energy of someone who had decided, somewhere in her mid-50s, that warmth was an inefficiency she could no longer afford. The office was on the 3rd floor, and the view behind Voss's desk was the parking structure, which Claire had always found fitting. Grayson was already there. So was the head of nursing, a man named Dale Fitch, who held his pen the way people hold pens when they're about to write something on official paper. Nurse Donovan, Voss said, thank you for coming in. Claire sat down. We've reviewed the events of last night, Voss continued, and while we understand that you acted with what you believed were the patient's best interests in mind, she paused in the specific way that people pause before removing a compliment entirely. What you did constitutes a significant deviation from established clinical protocol. You directed imaging orders through a hospitalist on a patient assigned to trauma. You effectively bypassed the trauma attending in the management of that patient's care. I requested imaging based on clinical observation, Claire said. Dr. Solon reviewed the findings and ordered the procedure. Dr. Solon has been spoken to, Grayson said. There was no particular inflection in it. That was almost worse. The patient had a missed hemothorax. He's alive. That outcome doesn't change the process violation, Voss said. We have protocols for a reason, Nurse Donovan. In a mass casualty event especially, Claire said, patients die when the protocol is slower than the injury. That was that situation. Silence. Fitch clicked his pen twice. Effective immediately, Voss said. You are placed on administrative duty. No patient care responsibilities pending a full review of last night's incident. You'll report to records and compliance for the duration. Claire looked at her, then at Grayson, who was studying the middle distance with the expression of someone performing restraint. Then back at Voss. Understood, she said. She stood up, collected nothing. She'd brought nothing to bring. and walked out of the office, down the hallway, and into the elevator. She pressed the button for the basement floor where the medical records archive was located because she had nothing else to do and nowhere else to be, and she had learned a long time ago in a very different context that when everything above you is compromised, you go underground and you start reading. The archive was cold and lit with fluorescence and smelled of old paper and the particular chemical note of document storage solutions. A records technician pointed her toward a workstation without looking up from his screen. She sat down. She logged in with her employee credentials. She was supposed to be reviewing archived intake forms for a compliance audit that nobody actually cared about. She started reading instead. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, just following the thread of something that had been itching at the back of her mind since the previous night. The patient in Bay 11, the way he'd been hurt, the way he'd known to say what he'd said. The company listed on his admittance record, not an employer, a health insurance carrier, a name she'd clocked when she'd pulled his file the night before that had seemed slightly out of alignment with the rest of his details. The company was called Veritas Medical Group. She searched the internal admissions database. Veritas Medical Group appeared as the guarantor on 2 other patient records over the preceding 3 weeks. Both patients had been admitted briefly, discharged within 48 hours, and their records contained certain notations, insurance verification references, third-party billing codes, that didn't correspond to any insurance structure she'd encountered in 3 years of working through admissions paperwork. She opened the first file, then the second. She sat back. There was something underneath the surface of these records that didn't belong in a hospital database. Billing codes that routed to an entity she couldn't find in any standard medical provider registry. A sequence of admission timestamps that followed an irregular pattern, clustered around specific dates that she found herself mapping against something she had no official reason to be mapping them against. She was still staring at the screen when, outside the narrow basement window near the ceiling, 3 black SUVs rolled into the Redstone Regional parking lot and stopped in a formation that was not how civilian vehicles park. Claire saw the shadow of them past the window. She looked up. Then she looked back at the screen. Then she closed the files, logged out of the system, and sat in the fluorescent cold of the archive room, very still, understanding with the particular clarity of someone who has spent significant portions of their life in classified environments, that something was happening in this building that was not about a highway accident, and that she was once again exactly in the middle of it. She sat in that basement for 4 more minutes without moving, not because she was afraid. Fear had a different texture, and she knew it well enough to recognize when something else was happening. This was calculation. The kind that happens in the back of the brain while the front is still catching up. The kind she'd learned to trust in situations where moving too fast meant moving wrong. 3 SUVs, black, parked in a staggered formation that covered both exit lanes of the lot. The vehicles had stopped at 8:47 in the morning, which was not visiting hours and not a medical transport configuration and not anything a civilian fleet would produce. She had seen that parking geometry before, not in Colorado, not in any hospital, and the memory it attached to was specific enough to make her sit very still for exactly 4 more minutes before she stood up, straightened her badge lanyard, and went back to reviewing compliance intake forms like a woman who had noticed nothing at all. The records technician didn't look up when she left at 11:30. The 4th floor was quieter than usual for a weekday mid-morning, which meant the staff was either stretched thin, covering the previous night's extended shifts, or had been pulled to other departments. Claire changed her badge access tag at the nursing station and started the compliance paperwork she'd been assigned, working through it methodically, not rushing, not pausing. She answered 2 questions from a colleague about a patient chart she'd handled earlier in the week. She ate half a granola bar standing over the break room sink at noon. She did everything that a nurse on administrative desk duty was supposed to do, and she watched the hallways. At 12:14 p.m., 2 men in dark suits walked through the 4th floor corridor with the purposeful neutrality of people who are not there to see patients. They stopped at the nursing station and spoke to the charge nurse, a brief exchange, low voices, and the charge nurse pointed toward Administrator Voss's floor. Neither man showed any visible identification in the hallway. They didn't need to. The charge nurse's body language when she pointed had said everything about who she thought she was talking to. Claire watched them turn the corner and disappear toward the elevator bank. She looked back at her screen. She didn't sleep that night. Not for lack of trying. She lay flat on the bed and stayed still, and kept her breathing even, and her mind went around and around the same set of points in the way it always did when she was working a problem she didn't yet have enough data for. The Veritas Medical Group billing codes. The man in Bay 11, and the word he'd said. The SUVs. The pattern of the prior admissions. The dates. She got up at 3 a.m. and wrote it out on paper. An actual sheet of paper, the old way, because old habits from old contexts died slower than she would have liked. She mapped what she knew in 2 columns, what was visible to the hospital administration and what was visible only to her. The columns were significantly different lengths. She folded the paper, put it in the front pocket of her civilian jacket hanging on the chair, and went back to bed. She did not sleep, but she got through the night. The next 3 days had a particular quality that she'd experienced before, the quality of a situation that looks static on the surface, because everything underneath it is moving very fast in directions you can't fully see yet. She completed her compliance paperwork. She filed the intake forms. She ate lunch alone in the break room or the archive, depending on the day. She listened. Grayson was visibly satisfied, which was its own kind of information. He moved through the department with a slightly expanded energy, a fraction more deliberate in how he addressed the nursing staff, the particular body language of a man who has recently won something and wants the victory to be atmospherically present without being overtly stated. He asked her one question in passing on the second day, whether she'd completed the flagged audit forms, and she said yes, and he nodded and walked on, and that was the entire interaction. Voss had sent a formal written notice of the administrative placement to her email. The language was procedural and careful and referenced collaborative review processes and established clinical governance frameworks in a way that was designed to sound balanced while containing absolutely nothing that could be appealed. Claire had read it once, saved it to a folder, and moved on. What she was actually doing, between the audit forms and the lunch breaks and the careful, visible ordinariness of a nurse on desk duty, was reading. She had access to the admissions database as part of the compliance audit. That access had a defined scope. Patient records from the last 18 months flagged for documentation irregularities. It was a narrow aperture, but she had spent years learning that a narrow aperture, properly angled, could illuminate a very large space. She found 3 more Veritas Medical Group records in the flagged set, all within the last 4 months, all short-stay admissions, 2 nights or fewer, all with the same irregular billing pathway that routed through a third-party processor she couldn't trace in any standard medical billing directory. The patients were listed under different insurance carriers on the surface records, but the underlying guarantor code, a detail buried 4 levels deep in the billing appendix that no standard auditor would reach because it wasn't part of the compliance review template, was identical across all 5 files she'd now found. The guarantor code resolved to an entity called Arcturus Financial Services, LLC, registered in Delaware, with a registered agent address that resolved to a commercial mail facility outside Wilmington. She stopped. She sat with that for a moment. Then she wrote it on her paper. On the 4th day after her suspension from patient care, she found the anomaly that changed the geometry of everything she'd been looking at. It was in the admissions record of a patient named Roland Ferris, admitted 8 days before the highway crash. Ferris had been listed as a 41-year-old male, admitted for observation following a reported cardiac event, discharged after 40 hours. His record looked clean at the surface level. An attending had signed off. The billing code was standard for a short cardiac stay. The insurance information appeared normal. But the discharge notes contained a medication notation that corresponded to a drug class that wasn't used in standard cardiac observation protocol. It was a medication used in specific post-operative contexts following trauma surgeries of a kind that did not appear anywhere in Ferris's documented medical history. Someone had given this man a medication that didn't match his stated reason for being there, and someone had documented it in a way that assumed nobody would ever read carefully enough to notice. Claire read carefully enough to notice. She sat back and looked at the fluorescent ceiling of the archive room for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone to call the one person at Redstone Regional she still trusted enough to say something out loud. Dr. Priya Solon picked up on the 3rd ring. "I need 5 minutes," Claire said. "I'm between rounds." 3 minutes. A short pause. "Stairwell B, 2nd floor." Priya was already there when Claire arrived, cup of coffee held in both hands, back against the wall between the second and third floor landings. She looked tired in the way hospital physicians always look tired, which was to say structurally, built into the architecture of her face. She looked at Claire and said, "You look worse than I do." "I found something," Claire said, "in the compliance files." "Claire, I need you to not tell me this isn't your problem yet. Just listen for 2 minutes." Priya's jaw tightened slightly, but she nodded. Claire told her. Not all of it. Not the man in Bay 11, not the word he'd said, not the SUVs. She told her about the billing anomaly, the guarantor code, the medication discrepancy in Ferris's file. She kept it to what could be verified by anyone with database access and a working knowledge of pharmaceutical protocols. When she finished, Priya was quiet for 4 seconds. That was longer than Claire had expected. "A medication discrepancy in an old discharge file," Priya said carefully, "isn't necessarily... It's a post-trauma analgesic in a patient admitted for cardiac observation with no documented surgical history. That's not a transcription error. You're on administrative suspension." "I know what I am?" Another pause. Priya turned the coffee cup in her hands. "What do you want me to do with this?" "Nothing yet. I want you to know it exists if something happens." Priya looked at her. "If something happens?" "Yes." "That's a sentence I don't love." "I know." Priya straightened away from the wall. She looked at the stairwell door, then back at Claire. "I reviewed your chest tube outcome notes from the other night," she said. "Your clinical documentation was impeccable, better than most attendings I've worked with." "Thank you." "That's not me being nice. That's me saying whatever you did before you came here, it wasn't nothing." She held Claire's gaze for another moment. "Be careful with whatever you're looking at." She went back through the door to the second floor. Claire stood in the stairwell and listened to the sound of the building around her. Ventilation, footsteps above, a distant elevator chime, and felt the weight of everything she wasn't saying pressing evenly on both sides. She had been careful before. Careful hadn't been enough before. She went back to the archive and worked through the afternoon. At 4:50 p.m., her access credentials stopped working. She tried twice. Both times the system returned the same message. "Employee access suspended. Please contact HR administration." She closed the screen, logged the time in her mental notes, and left the archive without speaking to the technician. They had noticed what she was looking at, or they had noticed that she was looking at all. The timing was not a coincidence. It was a compression, the kind that happened when a situation was moving toward a narrower point, when the people managing something from the inside started tightening the perimeter. She had 18 hours, maybe less, before the audit flag on her access generated a formal inquiry she'd have to respond to. She went home. She ate a bowl of soup standing at the stove. She changed into civilian clothes, drove to a public library branch 12 minutes from her apartment, and used a public terminal to search the Delaware Business Registry for Arcturus Financial Services, LLC. The company had been registered 3 years ago. The registered agent was a service company with 4,000 other clients. The listed managing member was a name she didn't recognize, Howard Pell, with a business address in Virginia. Not unusual. Delaware shell companies, by definition, weren't meant to be traceable. But the registration date and the initial filing address, cross-referenced against what she could find in a public federal contractor database, produced one result that landed with the flat, cold certainty of a thing she had half expected and still didn't want to see. Arcturus Financial Services had filed as a subcontractor on a Defense Department logistics support contract 3 years ago. The prime contractor was a company whose name she had seen before. Not recently, not in Colorado, but in a classified briefing document she had read in a different life, in a different uniform, about irregularities in military procurement that had never been publicly resolved. She closed the browser, cleared the history, and drove home in the dark. The next morning was a Friday. Her shift, such as it was, administrative only, started at 7. She arrived at 6:55, changed into her scrubs out of habit, even though scrubs were unnecessary for desk work, and was in the elevator heading to the 4th floor when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. 4 words. "Don't go to archives." She stood in the elevator and looked at the message for 2 full seconds. The doors opened on the 4th floor. She walked out. She sat at the nursing station and opened her assigned work queue and found that the compliance audit file had been reassigned to a different department employee. Her name had been removed from the project entirely. The reassignment notice, sent at 6:43 a.m., was signed by Dale Fitch. She checked her email. There was a second message from HR, time-stamped 7:01 a.m., 7 minutes after she'd arrived, requesting her presence in the administrator's office at 9 a.m. for a meeting regarding the ongoing review of clinical conduct concerns and associated access irregularities. She put her phone face down on the desk and looked at the opposite wall for a moment. They were moving quickly now, which meant they were scared of something. People didn't accelerate like this because they were confident in their position. They accelerated like this because something had shifted in the underlying situation and they needed to close off the loose ends before the shift became visible to anyone else. She spent the time between 7 and 9 doing something that looked, to anyone passing the nursing station, like routine documentation review. What she was actually doing was writing, in very small and very precise handwriting, on a folded notepad she kept in her scrubs pocket, everything she had found and everything she had observed, organized in the sequence that would be most useful to someone reading it without context. Names, dates, file reference numbers she'd memorized, the Arcturus Financial Services registration information, the medication discrepancy, the billing pathway, the SUVs, and the dates of the admissions. She finished at 8:44. She folded the notepad, put it in her pocket, and walked to the administrator's office. Voss was there. Grayson was there. Dale Fitch was there, pen in hand. And there was someone she didn't recognize, a man in a suit with a lanyard that read Legal Counsel, Redstone Regional, who was approximately 40 and had the specific energy of someone brought into a room specifically to make the room's intentions official. "Please sit down," Voss said. Claire sat. "As you're aware," Voss began, "there are ongoing concerns regarding events from the mass casualty incident on November 14th. In addition to those concerns, it has come to our attention that during your assignment to administrative duty in the Records and Compliance Department, you accessed patient files outside the designated scope of your assigned audit." "I was reviewing flagged files within the compliance database," Claire said. "The scope of your audit assignment was specifically defined," Fitch said. "The files you accessed fell outside that definition. The scope definition didn't specify a restriction on adjacent flagged files." "Nurse Donovan." Legal counsel's voice was the practice neutral of someone who had been specifically hired to make things sound inevitable. "The hospital's position is that accessing those records constituted an unauthorized use of your employee credentials, in addition to the existing clinical conduct concerns. We're here today to inform you that the hospital is formally terminating your employment, effective at the close of business today." The word terminating sat in the air of the room. She looked at Voss, then at Grayson, who was doing the middle distance thing again with an additional layer of something she might have called relief if he'd been capable of it. Then back at legal counsel, whose face was arranged in the practiced expression of institutional neutrality. "I'd like to receive all of this in writing," she said. "Of course," Fitch said. "That will be sent to your email on file." "I'd also like to know," she said slowly, watching Voss as she said it, "whether the termination decision was reached before or after the audit access review was initiated." A very short silence. "The review identified concerns that," Fitch started. "I'm asking which happened first," Claire said. "The decision or the review?" Voss's expression didn't change, but something around her eyes did. "The review generated findings that informed—" "You accessed my credentials log," Claire said, "at 4:53 p.m. yesterday. My termination notice would have required legal review and administrator authorization. That process takes a minimum of several hours at this hospital based on the HR handbook, which I've read, which means the decision was made before the review was completed." Legal counsel shifted slightly in his chair. "Nurse Donovan," he said, "I want to be clear that we are prepared to discuss a formal separation." "I don't want a separation package," Claire said. "I want the name of the third-party medical administrator associated with the Veritas Medical Group billing accounts in the records I reviewed to be provided to me in writing within 24 hours. The silence this time was different, longer, denser. Voss looked at Grayson. The look was brief, but she caught it, the way she had caught 1,000 brief looks in her life that meant something more than their duration suggested. "I don't know what you're referring to," Voss said. Her voice was even. "I think you do," Claire said. She stood up. I'll clear my locker today. Please send the termination paperwork to my email. She walked out of the room. In the hallway outside Voss's office, she kept her pace measured. Down the corridor, past the elevator. Down the stairs. She always took the stairs now, automatic, through the second floor, past the surgical unit, past the imaging hallway, and into a corridor that dead-ended at a supply storage room she knew was unlocked because the latch had been broken for 6 weeks, and the maintenance request had been submitted and ignored. She went inside, closed the door, stood in the dark with cleaning product and supply box smells, and let herself shake for about 40 seconds, which was the amount of time she'd learned she could afford in a situation like this one before it became counterproductive. Then she stopped shaking, took a breath, and made herself think clearly. She needed the notepad to reach someone, not Priya. Priya was inside the institution, and the institution was compromised in ways she couldn't fully map yet. The text message from that morning, "Don't go to archives," had come from someone who knew what she was looking at and knew enough to warn her, which meant there was at least one person adjacent to this situation who wasn't working against her, but she had no way of identifying who that was without exposing herself further. She had the names, she had the dates, she had the billing pathway, and the medication anomaly, and the Delaware company, and the Defense Department contract reference. She had the code word from the man in Bay 11. What she didn't have yet was the piece that connected the hospital to whatever was above it. The piece that explained not just the fraud but the why of it. The operational reason that a classified billing pathway existed inside a regional Colorado hospital's admissions system. She was still working through the architecture of that problem when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Stopped directly outside the supply room door. She held completely still. The door opened. It wasn't Voss. It wasn't Grayson. It wasn't legal counsel or Dale Fitch or anyone she'd seen inside that termination meeting. It was the patient from Bay 11. He was in civilian clothes, dark jeans, gray jacket, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who was functional but not fully healed. His left arm was held slightly away from his body in the unconscious accommodation of a man with a thoracic injury still in the early stages of recovery. He looked at her in the dim supply room light with the same complete, watchful attention she'd seen when he opened his eyes on the gurney. "You were discharged," she said. It came out flatter than she intended. "Yesterday," he said. "You shouldn't be mobile, not fully, not after a hemothorax that size." "I know." He said it without apology, which was the correct response. "We need to talk." "Yes," she said. "We do." "Not here." He glanced toward the door. "How much do you have on paper?" She felt the notepad in her pocket. "Enough." "The people who set up the billing structure inside this hospital," he said, "aren't just connected to financial fraud. One of the patients admitted through that system 3 weeks ago. He was placed here deliberately. Medical cover for an individual who was moving intelligence assets through civilian infrastructure. The crash on Devil's Bend was not an accident. My convoy was targeted because we'd identified the pathway." He paused. His breathing was controlled, but she could see the effort it cost him. "They know you found the files. They moved faster than we expected." "We," she said. His expression didn't change. "You're going to want to tell me who he is," she said. "There are people outside this building right now who have been waiting for confirmation that the internal trail is intact. The paperwork you found, the billing pathway, is one of 3 pieces they need." He looked at her directly. "You're the second piece." She absorbed that. "And the third?" "A witness inside the hospital administration. Someone who handled the admissions manually and has been waiting for a way out." He held her gaze. "His name is Roland Ferris." Claire blinked. "The cardiac patient," she said. "He wasn't a patient." "He was. He just wasn't there for his heart." Something moved through the man's expression. Not quite regret, not quite weight. Something in between. "He's still in the building. They don't know that yet. But if they figure out you found his file..." A sound in the hallway. Both of them went silent. Footsteps. 2 sets. Moving toward the supply room from the direction of the elevator bank, with the particular pace of people not walking casually. The man from Bay 11 looked at her. She looked at the secondary supply access door on the far wall that she'd clocked the first week she worked this floor and never mentioned to anyone. "Go," she said quietly. He went. She followed, pulling the secondary door closed behind them just as the primary door opened. They moved through the maintenance corridor in silence, and outside, beyond the narrow maintenance windows, she could see 3 black SUVs still parked in the lot below. But there was a 4th one now, and it was parked directly behind hers. She gave herself 3 seconds to look at the 4th SUV, not because she needed 3 seconds to process what it meant. She understood immediately what it meant, but because in her experience, the first response to a compression point was almost always the wrong one, and 3 seconds of stillness was usually the difference between a decision and a reaction. The vehicle was parked at an angle that blocked her rear bumper and left about 8 inches of clearance on the driver's side. Not enough to pull out without contact, not an accident. Someone had positioned it there deliberately, which meant someone knew which car was hers, which meant the termination meeting had not been the end of this morning's agenda. She turned from the window. The man from Bay 11, she still didn't have his name, had not asked, understood instinctively that asking in a maintenance corridor was not the right move, was watching her with the particular patience of someone accustomed to waiting on other people's calculations. "Is there another exit from this corridor?" he asked. "Loading dock, east side, accessible from the service elevator at the end of this hall." "Do they know this building's layout?" "They know the parking lot," she said. "Whether they know the internal structure depends on how much time they had to prepare." She moved past him toward the service elevator. "My read is they had enough time to cover the exits they could see from outside, not enough to have someone inside every service corridor." "That's an optimistic read." "It's a functional one." She pressed the elevator call button. Optimism would be assuming they'd only sent 4 vehicles. The elevator came. They got in. She pressed the sublevel button, not the loading dock level, one below it, and watched the doors close. The sublevel was the mechanical plant. Boiler systems, HVAC equipment, electrical panels, and a network of maintenance tunnels that connected Redstone Regional's original 1970s structure to its newer wings. She had discovered this on her 3rd week at the hospital when she'd taken a wrong turn during a fire drill and ended up 40 feet underground in a tunnel that smelled like rust and heated pipe insulation. She had since memorized the tunnel layout the way she memorized most things. Not deliberately, not as a project, but because her brain attached information to spaces the way other people's brains attached information to faces. She led him through the plant floor without speaking, navigating between the boiler housings and the electrical conduit racks, and he kept pace without asking where she was going, which told her something about his training and something about how much he was managing through the pain he was visibly not acknowledging. "Your chest," she said, without slowing. "I'm fine." "You're not, but we'll deal with that later." She turned left at the second junction toward the tunnel access door. "How long have you been mobile?" "Since yesterday afternoon." "That's too soon." "I know." "You have fluid risk if you're—" "I know, Donovan." She stopped, turned to look at him. He looked back at her with the directness of someone who has been in enough situations to understand that there are moments when precision matters more than politeness. "I've managed worse. Keep moving." She kept moving. The tunnel access door required a maintenance key that she'd had duplicated 6 months ago during a period when she'd been temporarily assigned to help coordinate a facilities audit. An assignment given to her, she suspected, because Grayson thought it would be a sufficient humiliation. She'd treated it as an intelligence-gathering opportunity and said nothing to anyone. The key turned cleanly in the lock. The tunnel beyond was exactly as she remembered, 5 feet wide, 7 feet high, lit by caged safety fixtures every 30 feet, smelling of condensation and old concrete. It ran northeast for approximately 200 yards before surfacing at a utility access point in the parking structure adjacent to the hospital's pharmacy supply entrance. The pharmacy structure had its own street-level exit onto a side street that didn't connect to the main hospital lot. They moved through it in silence except for the sound of their footsteps and the background industrial noise of the building's mechanical systems. She set a pace that was fast enough to matter and slow enough that he could maintain it without aggravating the injury she could tell, from the slight irregularity in his breathing, was already making itself known. Halfway through the tunnel, he said, "My name is Garrett Howell, Colonel, U.S. Army Intelligence, retired, officially. The convoy on Route 7 was a covert transport operation. We were moving a witness and a set of documentation under civilian cover." "The documentation," she said. "Yes." "Related to Arcturus." A half-second pause. "You found the company." "Delaware Registry, Federal Contractor Database. The procurement irregularities tie back to a contract I heard about in a different context. She glanced at him without breaking stride. About 8 years ago. Another pause, longer this time. You were at Kessler. It wasn't a question. She didn't answer it. What happened to the documentation from the convoy? Partially recovered. Not fully. There were 3 encrypted drives. 2 were secured by the team that reached the crash site first. The third is unaccounted for. His voice was even, but the weight behind it wasn't. The convoy was hit because someone inside the intelligence distribution chain knew our route. That leak originated from inside this hospital's administrative structure, from the same pathway that's been running the Arcturus billing operation. She processed that. The hospital is a communication node. Has been for 14 months. The fake admissions were cover for in-person handoffs. Medical facilities are low-scrutiny environments for short stays. People come in, people go out. No one asks why. Veritas Medical Group is a front that exists to create plausible paper trails for individuals who need to move through civilian infrastructure undetected. Roland Ferris was a courier, she said. Was. He's been trying to extract himself for 4 months. He has copies of internal communications that document the full network. Names, dates, handoff locations. He's the third piece my team needs to close the evidentiary package. And he's still inside the hospital. 3rd floor. He checked himself back in 2 days ago using a different name. Chest pain complaint, which for a man his age gets you admitted without too much scrutiny. He knew the network was collapsing, and he needed cover while he waited for an extraction window. The tunnel ended at the utility access stairs. She went up first, cracked the door at the top, checked the pharmacy structure's interior, empty, early afternoon, the delivery bay to her left clear, and waved him through. They came out into the pharmacy structure and moved to the street-level exit. The side street beyond was quiet. A delivery van parked at the curb. 2 pedestrians half a block away, walking away from them. I have a vehicle 2 blocks north, Howell said. You drove yourself here. Technically, I was driven. My contact dropped me and is waiting. Your contact sent me the text this morning. Yes. She absorbed that. And Ferris? Does your contact know his location inside the building? Not specifically. We know he checked in. We don't have the room number. He paused. We also don't know whether the people managing the Arcturus operation inside the hospital have identified him yet. If they have, they'll move on him before he can talk to you. Yes. She stood at the street-level exit and looked at the ordinary Friday afternoon of a street she'd driven past 100 times. And she thought about a man on the 3rd floor of the building behind her who had handled dirty money and dirty information and was now sitting in a hospital bed under a fake name, waiting for someone to come through the door, not knowing if the next person through it would be an extraction team or the people he'd been trying to get away from. I need to go back in, she said. Howell looked at her. You've been terminated. My badge still works until end of business today. They said so in the meeting. She met his eyes. Standard HR procedure is to deactivate access at 5 p.m. on the effective date of termination. It's 1:20 in the afternoon. If they see you, they're watching the parking lot and the main entrances. I just came out through a pharmacy tunnel. I'll go back through the main lobby. I'm still a current employee until 5 o'clock, and walking in through the front door is less suspicious than anything else. She looked at him steadily. Get to your vehicle. Tell your contact to be ready to receive a patient transfer. Ferris is going to need medical support. If he's been under stress and actually symptomatic, a reactivated cardiac concern is not out of the question. Howell held her gaze for a moment. You understand that if they've already moved on Ferris, you're walking into a contained situation. I've walked into contained situations before. Not in scrubs. The scrubs help, she said, and she turned and walked back toward the hospital. The main lobby of Redstone Regional at 1:30 on a Friday afternoon was the organized, controlled movement of a facility that had processed thousands of visitors and knew exactly how to make that processing invisible. She walked in through the main doors, badged through the employee access gate with a card that still worked, and took the main elevator to the 3rd floor. 3rd floor was the General Internal Medicine Unit. Longer stay patients, chronic condition management, cardiology overflow. She knew 2 nurses on this floor by name and had covered 1 shift here in her 2nd year. She knew the layout, Nursing station at the center, rooms running in two wings off the central corridor, a family waiting area near the elevator bank, a secondary nursing alcove on the east wing near the fire exit stairs. She went to the secondary alcove first because it had a workstation that was usually unoccupied in the early afternoon when the floor nurses were doing post-lunch rounds. She logged in with her credentials, still active, and pulled the admissions list for the last 48 hours under the search parameters cardiology observation, male, admitted November. She stopped herself. Too specific, too searchable if anyone was watching the access logs. She broadened the search to all admissions over 72 hours and scanned manually. 14 patients currently on the floor. She moved through the names and ages, 7 women, 7 men. She was looking for a man in his early 40s, admitted with a cardiac complaint in the last 2 days, under a name that wasn't Roland Ferris. 4 male patients matched the age range. She pulled each chart. The third one stopped her. Thomas Ray, listed as 43, admitted Wednesday with unstable angina, referred from an urgent care clinic, whose address didn't appear in any clinic directory she'd used in 3 years of working this hospital. His insurance was through a carrier whose policy number format was slightly wrong. 1-digit transposition in the group code that an automated system would accept and a human would only notice if they were looking. His attending was listed as a hospitalist she didn't recognize, which wasn't unusual for overflow cases. But the notation in the intake nurse's file said, patient requested private room, single occupancy, paid out-of-pocket differential. People who were genuinely frightened about their heart did not usually prioritize room privacy above everything else. Room 318, East Wing. She logged out of the workstation and moved into the east corridor. The floor was quiet in the mid-afternoon lull. She passed 2 rooms, a linen cart, a nurse moving the other direction, who glanced at her badge and kept walking. She got to 318 and knocked twice, short. No answer. She pushed the door open. The room was occupied. A man in the bed, 40-something, dark-haired, the particular skin tone of someone who had spent the last several days not sleeping enough and worrying too specifically, looked up from a position of someone who had not been resting but had been sitting at a precise angle to maintain a sightline on the door. He relaxed fractionally when he saw Scrubs, then less fractionally when he looked at her face. "I don't know you," he said. "No," she said, and let the door close behind her. "My name is Claire Donovan. I was a nurse in this hospital until this morning. I found your file in the compliance database, the original one, from your admission 3 weeks ago." His expression didn't change, but his body did. A very slight recalibration, something settling or tensing. She couldn't quite separate which. "You found the medication notation?" "Yes." He said nothing for a moment. He looked at the window, then back at her. "How did you know to come to this floor?" "Garrett Howell told me you were here." Something crossed his face at that name. Not relief. Relief would have been too clean. Something more complicated, more tired. "Howell is alive." "Yes." "Recovering." "He's outside the building." The man exhaled. It was a short sound, not dramatic, but she could hear the weight it released. "I've been in this room for 2 days waiting for someone to either come to extract me or come to do the other thing. I couldn't contact anyone without compromising the channel. I couldn't leave without a legitimate discharge." He looked at his hands, then back up. "I have the communications. Everything. I've had them for 4 months. Physical copies? Encrypted drive. And here," he tapped his temple, "names, dates, handoff sequences. 4 senior hospital administrators who were knowingly facilitating the operation. 2 of them took direct payments. 1 of them passed convoy route information that caused the ambush on Route 7. 1 of them being in this hospital. The CEO, he said, Sandra Voss." The name landed without surprise, which told her something about the shape of the last week, how a picture sometimes assembles itself below the level of conscious recognition, and you only know you'd already seen it when someone else names it aloud. "And Grayson?" she asked. "Peripheral." He didn't know the full scope. He was used for internal suppression, keeping certain staff from looking too closely, paid in professional favors, not money. Ferris's jaw tightened. He's still culpable. He knew something was wrong, and he made the people who noticed it disappear. She thought about the recertification block, the 2 failed promotions, the proposal credit, 3 years of professional erasure executed with the precision of someone who'd been given a target. I need to get you out of this room, she said. I have a legitimate medical admission, which won't protect you if Voss has identified that you're here. She looked at the door. How was the room payment processed? Cash. Through the intake clerk. The intake clerk reports to hospital administration for end-of-day reconciliation. She did the math. Cash differential payments get flagged in the daily revenue summary. If Voss reviewed today's summary, she already knows I'm here, Ferris said. He said it quietly and without particular emotion, the way people state things they've already made peace with. I realized this morning, the attending who came in for rounds, he asked me 2 questions that weren't about my cardiac status, questions about what I'd been doing before the admission. He was assessing me. His eyes met hers steadily. I've been waiting to see who comes through the door next. She was already moving, crossing to the room's built-in wardrobe, pulling it open. His civilian clothes were folded on the shelf, dark pants, a button-down shirt, shoes below. Get dressed. We're leaving as a voluntary discharge. I can't. You're a voluntary admission, which means you can request discharge at any time. I'll walk you out as a nurse facilitating a patient's administrative exit. If anyone stops us, you're experiencing anxiety about your hospitalization and have requested to follow up with your outpatient physician. She turned to face him. Can you walk at a normal pace without looking like you can't? He looked at her. Yes. Then get dressed. We have... She checked the clock on the wall above the door. 1:58 p.m. 3 hours and 2 minutes before my badge stops working. Move. He got up faster than she expected, which told her that the cardiac complaint was functional cover and not entirely fabricated. He moved to the wardrobe, and she turned her back and looked at the door and listened to the floor sounds. Elevator chime 2 wings over, cartwheels on linoleum in the main corridor, the faint rhythm of a floor that was not yet alarmed. She was still listening when she heard footsteps stop outside the door of 318, not the approach and continue of a nurse doing rounds. The stop and wait of someone who had arrived at a specific destination and was pausing for a specific reason. She moved to the left of the door frame in 3 silent steps, positioning herself outside the sightline from the door's small window panel. She looked at Ferris. He was half-dressed, shirt on, pants on, shoes in hand, and she held up one flat palm. He stopped completely. The door opened. The man who came in was not a physician. He was wearing the gray uniform of the hospital's facilities and maintenance department, badge, work boots, the handheld radio that maintenance staff carried on their belts. He was somewhere in his late 30s, with the particular physical quality of someone who spent time on his fitness with a specific purpose in mind, not general wellness. His hands were empty. His eyes went immediately to the bed, found it unoccupied, and then moved to find the room's other occupants. He saw Ferris first. Then he saw Claire, and the way his eyes tracked from her badge to her face told her that he already knew who she was. She knew what this was. Not a maintenance check, not a coincidence. This was the man sent to determine whether Ferris had become a problem that needed to be resolved before an extraction team could reach him. He said nothing. She said nothing. The 3 of them occupied the room for 1 full second in which everything was completely legible to everyone and nothing had yet been committed. Then he moved and she moved and the room became something else entirely. I was bigger than her and faster than the average person, but he moved like someone trained in restraint and control rather than combat. The difference between a man whose job is to contain people quietly and a woman who had spent 2 years training in environments where the objective was staying alive. She had a 4-inch reach disadvantage, and she used the door frame and the IV stand as structure, and she did not fight the way it looked in training films. She fought the way she'd been taught to fight when the person across from her was larger, and she was in a small space, efficiently, without wasted motion, aiming for the joints and the pressure points and the balance rather than the strength. It was not clean. It was not quick in the way movies made it look. It took 40 seconds, and she took a forearm to the side of her head that rang her ears, and she put her elbow into his shoulder socket at an angle that made him lose the grip on her left arm, and she used that to get behind him, and then it was over, or over enough. She had the IV stand across his upper arms from behind, and her weight braced against the wall, and he was contained and breathing hard, and she was also breathing hard, her ears still ringing, a hot line of pain across her left cheekbone. "Don't," she said. He stopped trying. Ferris had pressed himself against the far wall. His shoes were still in his hand. "Put your shoes on," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was somewhat surprised by that. She held the maintenance man in position while Ferris got his shoes on, while she thought fast about the next 3 minutes. She couldn't leave this man free in the room. He'd have someone at the exit before they reached the elevator. She couldn't leave him injured in a way that would trigger an immediate emergency response. She needed a window, not a permanent solution. The IV line on the empty bed's pole still had a bag attached. She looked at it, calculated, and looked at the crash cart position on the wall. She made a decision that was clinically uncomfortable and tactically necessary, and she did not let herself think about it past the level of practical logistics. She used the patient restraint straps from the bed. Hospitals kept them in the side cabinet of every room, standard psychiatric protocol. She knew exactly where they were, and she secured him to the bed frame in a position that was uncomfortable but not dangerous, and she used a spare pillowcase as a gag that was loose enough to breathe through and not loose enough to call for help through, and she checked his circulation at the wrists before she stepped back. 2 hours, she said to him. Shift change is at 4. Someone will be in this room before then. He looked at her with the specific expression of a man reassessing his morning. She picked up the radio from his belt, turned it to a frequency she selected by counting channels from the hospital's standard maintenance band. 1 step off, which would receive but not transmit clearly to anyone monitoring. She set it on the windowsill. Then she looked at Ferris, who was watching her with an expression that had moved past surprise into something she recognized as the particular recalibration that happened when a person discovered that someone they'd been categorizing as a civilian was something else entirely. "Don't," she said. He understood. He followed her out of the room. They moved through the east corridor at the pace of a nurse facilitating a patient's administrative exit, brisk but not alarmed, purposeful but not fleeing. She kept her body language at the neutral professional register she'd maintained on floors like this one for 3 years, the register that made her invisible in plain sight. Ferris walked beside her with his jaw set and his eyes forward, and if he was scared, it didn't show in his gait, which was something she filed away. At the elevator, she pressed the button for the lobby level. The wait was 20 seconds. She counted them. The doors opened on the lobby, and she saw, immediately, the 2 men in suits from the day before standing near the main information desk. One was facing the elevator bank. He saw her badge. He saw the man beside her. His hand went toward his jacket. She turned 45 degrees and pushed through the door marked Staff, Authorized Access Only, that led to the administrative corridor behind the lobby desk, which connected to the employee exit on the building's south side. The door locked behind them. They were in a corridor she knew well. She moved fast and he kept pace, and they went through the south employee exit into the cold afternoon air, onto the side path that ran along the building's south face toward the street on the far end. No vehicles in this side lot, no suits. The path was empty all the way to the street. She pulled out her phone and dialed the number the text that morning had come from. It picked up on the first ring. "South side exit," she said. 2 people. "We need the vehicle now." Silence for 2 seconds. Then, 4 minutes. She looked at Ferris. He looked at her. His face was pale from the exertion and something else. The particular pallor of a man who had been sitting alone with a very heavy thing for a very long time and had just been picked up and moved at a speed he hadn't anticipated. "Are you actually symptomatic?" she asked. "Cardiac, I mean." He thought about it, which was not the answer she'd have liked. "Intermittently, stress-induced. I have a history." "Great," she said flatly. "We'll deal with it." They stood against the south wall in the cold, and she watched the street and counted seconds, and was on 140 when the vehicle appeared. A dark blue pickup truck, civilian plates, moving at a normal speed. It pulled to the curb without drama, and the driver reached across and pushed the passenger door open, and she put Ferris in first and climbed in after. The driver was a woman in her mid-40s, dark hair cut short, wearing civilian clothes with the practiced casualness of someone accustomed to looking like whoever she needed to look like. She glanced at Claire once, and the look contained a complete assessment that lasted approximately 1 second. "Howell's at the secondary location," she said. She pulled out smoothly. "We've got a problem." "One problem or multiple?" Claire said. "One primary." The driver's eyes moved to the rearview mirror. "The encrypted drive from the convoy. The third one, the missing one. It wasn't lost in the crash." Ferris tensed. "It was recovered," the driver continued, "by someone at the scene before our team arrived. Someone who knew what it was and knew enough to pull it from the wreckage before the first responders cataloged the scene. She turned left. We got a confirmation 20 minutes ago from a secondary source. The drive is back inside Redstone Regional. Claire felt the cold outside the window in the way cold felt when it was also something else. Someone brought it back in, she said. Someone who works there. The driver's eyes found hers in the mirror, and they are currently trying to access what's on it. When they do, when they realize what the full documentation contains, they will know exactly who in this city is working against them. Claire looked at the hospital receding in the side mirror, its upper floors visible above the surrounding buildings, the parking lot on its far side where 4 black vehicles were presumably still parked. How long until they can access the drive? She asked. Our analyst says the encryption is 12 to 18 hours for someone with mid-level capability. The driver paused. Or less than 2 hours for someone with the right hardware and the right clearance. Claire looked at the mirror. And the person who took it? We don't know their clearance level, the driver said, but we know their access. She paused again. The specific pause of someone delivering information they know will change the weight of the room. It's the attending physician who cleared your patient in Bay 11 on the night of the crash, she said. The one who labeled him stable and moved on. The one who had enough access to the crash site because he was listed as a medical observer for the county emergency response team. Claire was very still. His name, the driver said, is Miles Grayson. The name sat in the truck cab like something physical. Claire didn't respond immediately, which was the right call, because the first 3 things she wanted to say were all wrong in different ways. Too reactive, too personal, too much of what 3 years of accumulated erosion looked like, when it finally had a face and a shape and a reason. She looked out the passenger window at the Ashbrook streets moving past, and she let the information finish settling into the structure of everything she already knew, fitting it against the gaps and the edges, checking where it held and where it didn't. It held everywhere. The recertification block, the failed promotions, the proposal taken without credit, 3 years of being kept precisely useful enough to stay and precisely invisible enough not to matter. That wasn't the casual cruelty of an arrogant physician. That was management. That was a man who had been given a specific instruction to keep a specific person from looking too closely at anything, and who had executed that instruction through the most deniable mechanism available, institutional indifference. He hadn't needed to threaten her. He just needed to make sure she stayed small. How long has he been in this network? She asked. Her voice came out level. 14 months at minimum, the driver said. Possibly longer, but that's when the financial connection to Arcturus becomes traceable. She took a right onto a residential street and slowed. He wasn't running it. He was a facilitator, someone with enough institutional standing to manage the suppression side without being in the operational chain. He'd flag anything that looked like it was getting close, and Voss would respond. He flagged me. After the mass casualty incident. Before that, you apparently weren't registering as a concern. The driver glanced at her in the mirror. Whatever you found in the compliance database changed that. Ferris had been quiet in the back seat since the revelation. He spoke now, carefully. Grayson was at the crash site, the County Emergency Response Observer role. That's a volunteer designation, not a professional one. He'd have had access to the wreckage before the scene was fully secured. 20 to 30 minutes ahead of the federal team, the driver confirmed. Long enough to locate the drive if he knew what he was looking for, and if Voss had told him what was in the convoy. Voss knew about the convoy, Claire said. She knew a military intelligence transport was moving through the region. She didn't know the route until someone in the distribution chain provided it. The driver pulled to a stop in front of a house on a quiet block. Single story, attached garage, the kind of anonymous residential property that looked exactly like nothing. She passed the route information 12 hours before the convoy moved. Grayson would have been given the specific vehicle description afterward, when it became clear the crash had happened and the team was scrambling. Claire got out of the truck. The cold hit her face, and she was briefly, sharply aware of the pain across her left cheekbone from the forearm she'd taken in room 318, a dull, persistent line that she'd been filing under later for the last 40 minutes. She touched it once with 2 fingers, assessed it, and filed it under later again. The garage opened, and they moved inside. Howell was there, seated at a folding table with a laptop and 2 phones, and the particular quality of a man who had spent the last several hours stationary against his preference. He looked at Ferris for a long moment when they came through the door, and something passed between the two of them that Claire recognized as the specific weight of people who have been in a bad situation that only got worse and are now in the same room for the first time since it started. "You look terrible," Howell said. "You look worse," Ferris said. Neither of them were wrong. Howell looked at Claire next, at the cheekbone. "Who?" "Maintenance uniform. He's secured in room 3118. He'll be found at shift change." Which gives us, Howell checked his watch, under 2 hours before they know he's there, and confirm you both exited the building. He turned back to the laptop. "We have been working the drive problem. The third drive was pulled from the convoy by Grayson, and our technical analyst has been running the encryption spec. If he's using the hardware available through Veritas Medical Group's secondary IT infrastructure, which is what we'd expect given his access, he's looking at between 90 minutes and 2 hours to crack it." "How long ago did he get back to the hospital with it?" Claire asked. "We think shortly after his emergency response shift ended, which was approximately 5 hours ago." Howell looked at her steadily. "Which means he may have already accessed it." The room absorbed that. "Then we work on the assumption that he has," Claire said. "What's on the drive that changes his behavior once he reads it?" "Documentation of the full network. Names, account numbers, handoff logs." Howell's jaw tightened slightly. "Including his own name. Everything Ferris compiled over 4 months." Ferris sat down heavily in one of the folding chairs. "If he's read it, he knows I'm the source. He knows what I have. And he knows that anyone who's talked to me in the last 48 hours is a thread he needs to cut." He looked at Claire. "That includes you." "I know." "Donovan." Howell's voice was measured. "My team has been building a federal evidentiary case for 6 months. What we need, what we've always needed, is a clean chain of evidence that doesn't get compromised before we can deliver it to the Oversight Committee. Ferris's documentation, the drive's contents, and a credible first-person witness account of the suppression operation inside the hospital." He paused. "You found the billing anomaly independently. You documented it in hospital records. You were terminated before you could be officially questioned about what you found, which means your discovery exists in the compliance database as an unresolved flagged entry that the hospital cannot explain without implicating themselves." "You want my documentation," she said. "I want your testimony and your notes. Yes." She reached into her scrubs pocket and put the folded notepad on the table. He looked at it, then at her. "You wrote it out." "While I was sitting in a basement archive on desk duty," she said. "I had time." He opened it, read through it without speaking. The driver, who still hadn't given a name and Claire had stopped expecting one, came around the table and read over his shoulder. Howell's expression didn't change much as he read, but she could see the quality of his attention shift partway through, the slight forward lean that meant he was reading something that closed a gap. "The Arcturus registration date," he said, without looking up. "Cross-referenced against the federal contractor filing. The lag is 9 days. They registered the Delaware entity 9 days after the defense contract was awarded to the prime, which means the shell company was set up in response to the contract, not before it." He looked up. "That's the sequencing we've been trying to establish." "I thought it might be." He held her gaze for a moment with the particular expression of someone recalibrating something they'd assumed about a person. Then he looked back at the notes and kept reading. While he read, the driver moved to the corner of the garage with a phone and spoke in low, short exchanges that Claire caught fragments of. "Confirm the window. Federal authorization. We need the committee contact activated before end of business." She was building toward something, moving pieces that had presumably been in motion long before this afternoon, and the shape of what she was moving toward was beginning to clarify. Ferris had fallen asleep in the folding chair with the abruptness of a man whose body had simply stopped accepting directives. His breathing was even. His color was bad, but stable. She checked his pulse at the wrist, 88, slightly elevated, not alarming, and let him sleep. At 3:40 p.m., Howell's secondary phone rang. He answered it, listened for 90 seconds, and said 3 words, "Confirm and proceed." He hung up and looked at Claire. "Grayson accessed the drive," he said, 40 minutes ago. "Our analyst intercepted a data query from the hospital's secondary IT infrastructure. He ran a search against the drive's index file." He was looking for his own name. Did he find it? Yes. Howell stood up. And 20 minutes after that, he made a phone call to a number that connects to the Arcturus Network's emergency protocol. He's triggered their containment procedure. She understood immediately. He's going to run. Or he's going to try to destroy what he can before he does. The drive, Ferris's location, anyone who's seen the documentation. Howell was already moving, pulling a jacket from the back of his chair. Our federal authorization came through 15 minutes ago. We have a team assembling at the hospital now. But Grayson is still inside the building, and if he moves the drive before our team can secure it, he won't move it, Claire said. Howell stopped. Why not? Because moving it requires him to carry it out of the hospital on his person. He's a physician inside his own facility. His instinct under pressure is going to be to use the institution as cover, not abandon it. He'll try to destroy it in place. She was already thinking through the hospital's physical layout. He has access to the incinerator pathway through the medical waste disposal system. Biohazard materials go directly to thermal destruction. If he packages the drive in a medical waste container and routes it through the standard disposal chain, it's gone before anyone can intercept it. The disposal system runs on a fixed schedule. Last pickup on a Friday is at 4:30. She checked the wall clock. 3:43. 47 minutes. Howell looked at the driver. The driver was already on the phone. Our team won't be in position until 4:15 at the earliest, Howell said. Then someone needs to be inside before that. She held his gaze. My badge deactivates at 5. I still have access. Donovan, the disposal room is in the basement, southeast corner. He'll need a biohazard container, which means he'll either access the medical waste storage in the basement directly or route through a floor-level waste station. Either way, the intercept point is the disposal room. She picked up her badge from where it had been sitting on the table. I know this building. Your team doesn't. He studied her for a moment with the expression of a man doing a calculation he already knows the answer to. You understand that if he's already in that room, I know what I'm walking into. That's not reassuring. I know that too. He reached under the table and produced a radio, compact, clipped, and handed it to her. Channel 4, keyed to our team frequency. You see him in that room, you do not engage. You confirm his location, and you hold. She took the radio. Understood. She did not say, unless there's no other option. Some things were better left unvoiced. The driver took her back in the pickup truck, dropping her at the pharmacy structure entrance. The same exit they'd used 90 minutes earlier, now functioning as an entry. She badged through the pharmacy supply door. It worked. She moved through the tunnel, back into the mechanical plant sublevel, and from there up the service stairs to the basement level that housed the medical records archive, the central pharmacy stock, and in the southeast corner, the environmental services hub that managed the hospital's waste disposal operations. The basement corridor was quiet. It was always quiet at this hour. The environmental services staff ran most of their operations in the early morning and late afternoon, and the mid-afternoon window was the low point of their cycle. She moved along the corridor with her badge visible and her pace purposeful, and she was grateful, not for the first time, for the particular invisibility of a nurse in scrubs moving through a building, which was complete and total, and taken entirely for granted by everyone who saw it. She heard him before she reached the disposal room. Not his voice. Footsteps. The specific cadence she'd cataloged across 3 years of working the same floors, the weight and rhythm that she'd recognized in a dozen hallways without looking up from whatever she was doing, because that was how you survived an institution that was quietly hostile. You mapped the movements of the people who ran it. She slowed, moved to the edge of the corridor where the junction met the environmental services hallway. Looked around the corner. Grayson was at the medical waste storage station 12 feet from the disposal room door. He had a biohazard container, standard red bag class, the kind used for sharps and contaminated materials, open on the counter, and he was wearing nitrile gloves, and his movements were fast and tight in the specific way of a man who is frightened and concealing it behind procedure. He was putting something into the container. She couldn't see it from this angle, but she didn't need to. She pulled the radio from her pocket, keyed channel 4, spoke at the lowest possible audible volume. Target is at the medical waste station, basement southeast. He has the container open. A pause. Then Howell's voice, quiet and controlled. Team is 12 minutes out. Hold position. 12 minutes. She looked at the corridor clock above the junction, 4:11. The disposal pickup was at 4:30. She did the arithmetic. It did not produce a comfortable result. She watched him. He sealed the biohazard container. He labeled it. She could see him applying the standard disposal label from the dispenser on the counter, the automated part of the process, the thing that would route the container into the disposal chain without anyone physically reviewing its contents. He was going to drop it in the collection bin. The collection bin was on a pneumatic routing system that fed directly to the thermal disposal unit. Once it was in the bin, retrieval required a manual override from Environmental Services Management, which in turn required an administrator authorization that would take 20 minutes minimum to process. 12 minutes from now, Howell's team would walk in and find an empty waste station and a container already in the thermal queue. She looked at the corridor. She looked at Grayson. She looked at the collection bin 6 feet to his left, which he was moving toward. She walked around the corner. He heard her footsteps and turned, and for one full second the two of them looked at each other across 12 feet of basement corridor with the total mutual comprehension of people who have finally run out of intermediary space. His face did something she hadn't seen it do before. Not the contained authority of the trauma bay, not the managed satisfaction of the meeting room. Something rawer and less composed, and underneath it, the thing that had been underneath everything he'd done for 3 years, which was not arrogance so much as it was fear dressed up as arrogance. The specific fear of a man who has done something he cannot undo and has spent a very long time making sure no one gets close enough to see it. Donovan. His voice was still trying to find its professional register. It wasn't finding it. Dr. Grayson. She kept walking toward him at a measured pace, not aggressive, not retreating, the pace of someone who belongs exactly where they are. Step away from the collection bin. You're not... He stopped, started again. You don't have any authority in this building. You were terminated. My badge still works, she said, which makes me a current employee until 5 p.m., which means I'm authorized to be in this corridor. She stopped 8 feet from him. Step away from the bin. He looked at the container in his hands. He looked at her. He looked at the bin. She could see the calculation happening, could see the moment when he decided that the drive's destruction was worth whatever happened next, because whatever happened next was preferable to what was on that drive. He moved toward the bin. She moved faster, and what she did was not what a nurse was supposed to do in a hospital basement, and it was not clean, and it cost her the bruised cheekbone getting hit by the corner of the container as he swung it, and it cost him the container itself and his balance and his composure. And it ended with the biohazard container on the floor between them and Grayson against the wall and her between him and the bin, her hand flat on the container, her breathing harder than she'd have liked. Don't, she said. He was breathing hard too, his back against the wall, his composure entirely gone now. What was underneath it was not pretty. It was not the face of a villain in any cinematic sense. It was the face of a man who had made a decision 14 months ago that he'd probably told himself was manageable, and had found out across 14 months that it was not, and had spent those 14 months building a more and more elaborate structure of suppression and control to keep the original decision invisible, and was now looking at the complete collapse of all of it. They'll take everything, he said. His voice was almost conversational. It might have been the shock. Yes, she said. You don't understand what this... He stopped. His jaw moved. You were never supposed to be a problem. You were just supposed to stay small. She held his gaze and felt something move through her that was neither satisfaction nor anger, but something older and more tired than both. I know, she said. She heard the stairwell door at the end of the corridor open. Multiple sets of footsteps, purposeful and coordinated. Howell's team, 8 minutes earlier than projected, which meant the federal authorization had cleared faster than expected, which meant something above her pay grade had been moving in the background of this entire afternoon. 3 federal agents in plain clothes came around the corner with badges visible in body language that communicated terminal authority. Behind them, a 4th person, a woman in a dark suit with the particular presence of someone whose seniority was architectural, whose eyes went first to Grayson, then to Claire, then to the biohazard container on the floor. Dr. Miles Grayson, the lead agent said. The words had the quality of something that had been prepared. You are under arrest on federal charges, including conspiracy to obstruct a military intelligence operation, facilitation of a foreign intelligence asset network, an accessory to the ambush of a military convoy on November 14th. You have the right to remain silent. Grayson said nothing. He looked at the floor. The lead agent moved past Claire to take Grayson's arm, and she stepped aside, and the agent paused for one moment. You're Claire Donovan. Yes. Colonel Howell said to tell you the team found two things when they entered the hospital upstairs. He looked at her steadily. Administrator Voss was attempting to access and delete server records from her office. She's in custody. He paused. And Dr. Solon, the hospitalist, she called the federal tip line 40 minutes ago. Said she'd been sitting on some information and decided she didn't want to wait anymore. Claire absorbed that. Something in her chest shifted fractionally. Not surprise, but the quiet landing of a thing she'd hoped for without letting herself count on. The senior woman in the dark suit stepped forward. She had the bearing of someone who operated 3 organizational levels above the agents beside her and the economy of movement that came with it. She looked at Claire for a moment before she spoke, with the specific look of someone who has read a file and is now putting a face to it. There's a conversation that needs to happen, she said. Not here, and not tonight, but soon. She held out a card. My name is Adler. When you're ready. Claire took the card. She looked at it. Then she looked at Grayson being walked toward the stairwell in handcuffs, the biohazard container now inside an evidence bag, the basement corridor full of federal agents, and the specific antiseptic aftermath of something that had finally, after a very long time, been brought into the open. She looked at Adler's card again. The name on it was above a title she hadn't expected. Below it, in small type, was a unit designation that she recognized, not from her time at Redstone Regional, and not from her civilian life, but from a period before both of those, from a file she'd read in a briefing room under fluorescent lights in a building that didn't have a public address, the same file that had first told her about an irregularity in a defense procurement contract that nobody in authority had wanted to investigate. A unit that had been tasked, 8 years ago, with looking into exactly the kind of corruption that had now surfaced, mutated, and expanded inside a hospital in Ashbrook, Colorado. The same investigation, a different decade, and apparently the same thread finally pulled far enough to unravel something that had been hiding inside the machinery of a system that had spent 8 years making sure the right people stayed exactly small enough to miss it. She looked up at Adler. You've been running this for 8 years, she said. Adler's expression was not quite a smile. We've been trying to, she said. We kept losing the people who got close. Claire stood with that for a moment. The report I filed, she said, before I left the service. The procurement irregularities. She kept her voice even. It was buried. It was, Adler said, by people who are currently being named in federal indictments in 3 separate jurisdictions. She held Claire's gaze without flinching. It took us too long. That's not something I can correct. But what you found here, what you documented, independently, while being actively suppressed by people working for the same network, is the piece that closes the chain of evidence we've been building for the last 2 years. Claire looked at the evidence bag in the agent's hand, at the corridor now full of people who had arrived because of a thread she'd followed from a dead man's billing code in a compliance archive in a hospital that had spent 3 years treating her like furniture. She thought about the photograph on the top shelf of her bookcase, the one she kept face down. It had been face down for 8 years. She hadn't been ready to look at it because looking at it meant looking at what happened to the person in it and why. And following that thread had felt for a very long time like a direction with no end. She thought about Adler's card. She thought about what closed the chain meant for everything that came after. And then, from the top of the stairwell, Howell's voice came down. Donovan, Ferris's cardiac readings are spiking. He's asking for you. She put Adler's card in her pocket and moved toward the stairs without hesitation because a man's heart was misbehaving, and that was something she knew exactly what to do about. And some things, even at the end of a very long day, were still that simple. She was halfway up the first flight when her phone buzzed. A message from a number she didn't recognize. Not the same number as that morning. A different one. 4 words again. We still have leverage. She read the message twice. Not because she needed to read it twice to understand it. She needed the 2 seconds the second reading bought her to make sure that when she moved again, she moved correctly. The stairwell walls were close, and the fluorescent light was cold, and her left cheekbone was a sustained, dull complaint, and she was standing on a step with a federal agent's card in one pocket and a phone in her hand showing 4 words from a number that did not exist in any contact list she'd ever kept. "We still have leverage." She screenshotted it, forwarded it to Howell's number, typed 3 words back to the unknown number. "Received. Come forward," and put the phone in her pocket and continued up the stairs. She did not know yet what the leverage was. She knew it was real because people in collapsing networks did not send empty messages to terminated nurses in federal crime scenes. They sent messages when they had something to lose and something left to use, and the message meant that not everyone who needed to be contained had been contained yet. She filed that under Adler and kept moving because Ferris's heart was misbehaving and a man could not give testimony from a cardiac event. The garage safe house had a medical kit, better than standard, the kind assembled by people who operated in environments where emergency services were not reliably available. She'd clocked it when they arrived, and she went to it now with the directness of someone who has identified a resource and is using it. No preamble. Ferris was in the folding chair where he'd been sleeping, but he was awake now, and his color was the specific gray-tinged pallor of cardiac stress rather than exhaustion. His hand was at his sternum, and his jaw was tight. "Rate and character?" she said. "Fast. Irregular." He looked at her. "I've had this before. It settles." "When it settled before, what did it take?" "Metoprolol, 25 milligrams." He exhaled, and about 20 minutes of sitting still. The kit had metoprolol too. She'd noted it earlier, said nothing, filed it. She found it, confirmed the dosage, handed it to him with water. She kept her fingers at his wrist and counted while he swallowed. His pulse was irregular in the specific pattern of stress-induced atrial irregularity rather than anything more immediately dangerous. And after 90 seconds of monitoring, it began to show the first signs of settling, not fully but directionally. "Tell me something," she said, keeping her fingers at his wrist. He looked at her sideways. "What?" "When you compiled the documentation, the 4 months of it, did you know it would come to this?" He was quiet for a moment. His pulse ticked under her fingers, fast, uneven, gradually finding a less panicked rhythm. "I knew it would come to something. I didn't know what." He shifted slightly in the chair. "I'd been inside the operation for 11 months before I started compiling. I told myself for most of those 11 months that I was managing a situation, that the information I was moving wasn't, that the harm was abstract." He stopped. "Then a convoy got ambushed and people got hurt, and I stopped being able to make the abstraction work." She said nothing. His pulse steadied another degree. "I'm not a good person," he said. I want to be clear about that." "I'm not asking you to be," she said. "I'm asking you to be a live witness." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Fair." She checked his pulse one more time, released his wrist, and stood up. Howell was across the garage on the phone, his expression the controlled intensity of someone managing multiple simultaneous developments. The driver, whose name Claire had now been told was Marin, offered voluntarily and without context, was at the laptop, and what was on the screen was a federal indictment document with multiple names highlighted in yellow. Marin looked up when Claire approached. "The message you forwarded?" "Yes." "We ran the number. It's a burner purchased in Ashbrook 8 days ago. We can't trace the buyer without physical store footage, which we're requesting." She turned the laptop screen slightly. "But the content matches a communication protocol used by one specific node of the Arcturus network, the one that handled personnel rather than finance. The person who sent it was responsible for managing the network's human assets, the individuals who were placed, moved, or removed from positions." "The person who placed Grayson inside Redstone Regional," Claire said, "and who managed his direction." Marin's expression was level. "This individual has not yet been identified. They weren't in Ferris's documentation, because Ferris never had direct contact with them. They operated one level above Voss." "One level above Voss?" Claire thought about that, about the architecture of a system that had kept itself intact for 8 years by ensuring that each layer knew only the layer directly adjacent to it. Which means they're currently watching the hospital operation collapse and deciding whether to run or to use whatever they're holding. The message suggests the latter, at least initially. Marin looked at her. "What they have leverage over, we don't yet know." "I might," Claire said. Marin waited. "The report I filed 8 years ago, before I left the service. There was a secondary document attached to it, a list of specific procurement contract irregularities with named individuals. That list was classified above my pay grade, and I was never told what happened to it. She paused. But if someone in the network had access to the classification system, they'd know the list existed, and they'd know my name was on the originating report. They could use that. Only if they can make the argument that exposing what I knew then is more damaging to me than what's happening now. She held Marin's gaze. Which it isn't, but they might not know that yet. Marin studied her for a moment. You want to respond to them? I want to draw them out. She reached for the laptop, paused, looked at Marin. May I? Marin slid the laptop toward her. She typed a response to the burner number through the secure relay Marin set up, brief and specific. The leverage you're referencing is already in federal hands. Come in voluntarily or be the last one processed. She read it once and sent it before she second-guessed the tone, because tone mattered with people like this. Too conciliatory, and they'd calculate. Too aggressive, and they'd run. The message she'd sent was the specific frequency of someone who already knew the outcome and was offering one practical reason to choose the easier version of it. Then she stepped back and let it sit and went to check on Ferris. His color was better. Not good, but better. His pulse had returned to a sinus rhythm that was faster than she'd like, but was no longer the concerning irregularity of 40 minutes ago. He was eating a granola bar from the kit supplies with the mechanical diligence of a man who knows he needs calories and is not enjoying any of them. The testimony, she said. How prepared are you? I've been rehearsing it in my head for 4 months, he said. I'm prepared. The communication logs you have on the drive. Chain of custody is documented. I tracked every file's origin and handling. It'll hold. He looked at her. You're worried the case gets compromised. I'm worried someone we haven't identified yet does something in the next 12 hours that creates enough noise to delay a proceeding. She sat in the adjacent chair. What did the messages contain, the ones you compiled? Give me the structure. He was quiet for a moment, then 47 individual communications across 14 months. 11 of them contain explicit instructions for route information on military transport operations. 19 contain financial transfer authorizations through the Arcturus pathway. The remaining 17 are personnel management communications, people being placed, people being moved, people being suppressed. He paused. 3 of the 17 contain explicit references to an internal report that was filed approximately 8 years ago by a military medical officer attached to a special operations unit. She held very still. The communications discuss how the report was handled, he said carefully. Who authorized its burial? Which officials signed off on the classification upgrade that kept it from reaching the oversight committee? He held her gaze with the steadiness of someone delivering information they've been holding for a long time. Their names are in the logs. The garage was quiet, except for the sound of Howell's voice across the space, low and continuous, and the hum of the laptop, and the particular silence of a thing that has been lost for 8 years, arriving in a folding chair in an anonymous house in Ashbrook, Colorado, on a cold November afternoon. All of it will be in front of the committee, Ferris said. I made sure of it. She nodded once. Then she stood up and walked to the small, grimy window at the back of the garage that looked out onto the residential street, and she stood there for a minute and a half without speaking, watching the ordinary movement of an ordinary neighborhood, and she let herself feel the weight of what he'd just told her, the complete shape of it, and then she put it somewhere she could carry it and turned back to the room. Howell had ended his call. He looked at her across the garage with an expression that said he'd been listening to the last portion of the conversation and understood the significance of what had been said. The committee authorization is complete, he said. We have a sealed federal hearing scheduled for Monday morning. Ferris testifies, the documentation is entered, and the indictments proceed from there. He paused. Voss has already requested a cooperation agreement. She's giving up the full financial structure of the Arcturus network in exchange for a reduced charge consideration, which means she named everyone above her. Working through it with her attorneys tonight. He crossed the garage toward her. She named a number of individuals. One of them is the person managing the personnel tier. The burner number. Yes. He stopped 3 feet from her. His name is Warren Stills, former Defense Department contracting officer, separated from service 4 years ago. He's been operating the personnel management function of the network since its inception. He paused. He sent you a second message 40 minutes ago. She pulled out her phone. She hadn't felt it buzz, which meant the adrenaline of the last hour had been running her sensory system on a selective filter. She read the message. I'll come in. I need assurances on 2 counts. Tell Adler. She exhaled slowly. He knows Adler's name. He should. She ran the investigation that almost caught him 3 years ago. Howell's voice was dry in the particular way of someone who has spent a long time in a frustrating situation. He's been watching this case from the outside for long enough to know who the players are. She typed, "Message received. Contact Adler directly. Number follows." She sent it, then sent Adler's number in a separate message. She put her phone away. "Is that advisable?" she asked, giving him Adler's direct contact. "It's what Adler told me to do if he responded," Howell said. She's been waiting for him to reach out for 2 years. She thought about the card in her pocket, about the 8 years it had apparently taken to build a case around something she'd identified in a single report filed in a forward operating base with bad ventilation and worse coffee, in a week when 3 people she'd served with had been killed and she'd been told their deaths were unrelated to the procurement irregularities she'd been documenting. They hadn't been unrelated. She'd known that then. She'd filed the report anyway. And then the report had disappeared and she'd been quietly separated from her unit and eventually from the service, and she'd come to Ashbrook and put on scrubs and become furniture. She looked at Howell. "The officials who authorized the burial of my report. When the indictments proceed. They'll be named," he said. "The charges will include obstruction of a military investigation, conspiracy, and in 2 cases, accessory liability for the convoy ambush, given that the operational chain traces back to the suppression of the original report." He held her gaze. "What happened to you 8 years ago is going to be in the public court record." She nodded. "And your discharge," he said. "I spoke to the JAG officer attached to our oversight committee this afternoon. Your service record, the notation that resulted in your separation, was generated by one of the individuals now facing federal charges. A formal review petition has been filed. It will be fast-tracked given the direct connection to the active case." She was quiet for a moment, not because she didn't know how to respond, but because she was finding that the response she actually had was smaller and less dramatic than the occasion seemed to call for. 8 years of carrying something had a weight she'd grown accustomed to, and the first indication that the weight was going to be removed produced not elation, but a kind of careful stillness, the way a person moves when they've been told the surgery was successful and they don't want to disturb anything yet. "Okay," she said. It was a small word for a large thing, but it was the honest one. Howell looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a man who has also been carrying something for a long time and understands the smallness of the honest response. "Yeah," he said. The night that followed was long and procedural and exhausting in the specific way of situations where the dramatic part is over and the institutional machinery has taken possession of the outcomes. Federal agents processed the hospital's administrative records. Voss was transported to federal custody, and her cooperation debrief ran through the night with 2 attorneys and a federal prosecutor. Grayson was processed, charged, and held without bail on the basis of the flight risk assessment that his access to the Arcturus financial network produced. The maintenance operative from Room 3 on ET was found at shift change, as Claire had predicted, and taken into custody once the federal team identified his connection to the network. Warren Stills contacted Adler at 7:14 p.m. He surrendered voluntarily at a federal field office in Denver at 10:30 that same evening, with an attorney and a memory drive containing his own documentation of the network's 8-year operational history, which he had apparently been keeping as insurance against exactly the scenario that had now materialized. The irony of a man who managed a suppression operation having kept meticulous records of it was not lost on anyone, and the federal prosecutor's office reportedly received the news with the specific humor of people who have seen this before. Claire spent most of that night at a kitchen table in the safe house, going through her testimony with a JAG officer named Captain Theo Brandt, who was precise and patient and asked good questions without leading them, and who at the end of 3 hours of review said, "This is the cleanest independent evidentiary thread in this case." And she said, "Thank you." And he said, "I'm not complimenting you. I'm giving you a legal assessment." And she said, "I know." And they both almost smiled. She slept 4 hours on a cot in the safe house and woke at 6 a.m. to a message from Priya Solan. "I should have moved faster. I'm sorry." I need you to know that. She looked at it for a long moment, thought about the stairwell and the coffee cup, and the careful calculation of a woman who was not corrupt, not complicit, but frightened of the institution she worked inside. Frightened in the particular way of someone with a career and a life built inside a structure that didn't seem survivable if crossed. Priya had known something was wrong, and she had waited longer than she should have, and then she had called the federal tip line, which was not nothing. "You moved," Claire typed back. "That matters." She put the phone down. The Monday hearing was held in a federal building in Denver. The room was not dramatic. Gray walls, institutional carpet, a long table of committee members, a court reporter, and the specific airless quality of a proceeding that mattered enormously to the people in it and was entirely invisible to the world outside. Claire testified for 3 hours and 40 minutes. She was not nervous in any way. She hadn't been nervous before, and the nervousness she managed the way she'd managed it in other high-stakes rooms, by telling the exact truth in exact language and letting the truth do whatever it was going to do. The committee members asked thorough questions. Some of them she'd expected, some she hadn't. One senior member, a woman with the bearing of someone who had been in oversight positions for long enough to have seen most things, asked her, near the end, whether she had understood when she began looking at the billing anomalies what she was likely to find. "No," Claire said. "I knew something was wrong. I didn't know what." "And if you had known what?" She thought about it honestly. "I would have done the same thing," she said, "because a man was going to die if I didn't look, and looking was what I knew how to do." The room was quiet for a moment after that. "Thank you, Ms. Donovan," the senior member said. And the way she said it was not procedural. The indictments were unsealed on a Wednesday, 11 days after the crash on Devil's Bend. The public record named Sandra Voss, Miles Grayson, Warren Stills, and 9 additional individuals across 3 states, including 2 former Defense Department officials whose names appeared in connection with the burial of an 8-year-old military misconduct report. The coverage was significant. A regional hospital administrator and a trauma physician arrested on federal charges connected to a military intelligence operation was the kind of story that moved fast. The Ashbrook local paper had it on their front page. The National Wire Services picked it up by noon. Claire did not read the coverage. She was not avoidant about it. She simply had other things to do. She had agreed to meet Adler that morning at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the federal building, and she arrived 4 minutes early and ordered black coffee and sat at a table by the window and watched the Wednesday morning traffic of a city going about its business, which was what cities did regardless of what was happening in federal courtrooms and hospital administrative records, and which she found, for some reason, reassuring. Adler arrived exactly on time. She ordered nothing and sat down and put her hands flat on the table in the manner of someone setting the terms of a conversation. "Your service record review was completed Friday," Adler said. "The separation notation has been formally expunged. Your record reflects an honorable discharge with full restoration of rank and commendations." She paused. "All of them." Claire wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "All of them." "The commendation that was stripped in the year following your report," Adler said, "has been reinstated. It will appear in the official record with the original citation." She knew which commendation. She didn't need Adler to describe it. She nodded. "Additionally," Adler said, "the Oversight Committee has formally requested that your compliance findings and your operational documentation from the Redstone incident be entered into the permanent case record as independent civilian intelligence gathering. That's an unusual designation. It's also accurate." "I was doing a compliance audit," Claire said. "You were doing considerably more than that," Adler said, "and you know it." A pause. Outside the window, a woman walked past with a child on each side, each child saying something different simultaneously, and the woman was answering both questions at once, with the practiced resource management of a person handling multiple simultaneous demands, which was, Claire thought, a reasonable description of most of the last 2 weeks. "There's a proposal," Adler said. "I'm not here to pressure you, and I'm not here to make a formal offer, because this isn't a formal setting, but I want to put it in front of you." She held Claire's gaze. "The committee has been discussing the gaps that allowed a network like Arcturus to operate inside civilian medical infrastructure for 14 months before detection. Specifically, the gap in cross-referencing military medical training against civilian healthcare anomalies. The kind of pattern recognition that a trained military medical officer brings to a clinical environment that standard civilian oversight doesn't. She paused. There's interest in developing a liaison protocol, a small unit, initially an advisory function, that would embed individuals with relevant military medical backgrounds into the civilian oversight structure for healthcare facilities that intersect with defense infrastructure. You want a bridge, Claire said. We want someone to build one, Adler said. That's not the same thing. Claire looked at her coffee. She thought about the fourth floor at Redstone Regional, about the compliance forms and the medication audit she'd done in 30 seconds that the chart had missed, about the man in Bay 11 whose chest she'd read correctly because she'd been in places that taught her how to read it, about 3 years of being useful and invisible, and the 10 years before that of being trained for situations exactly like the one that had just unfolded in a hospital basement. She thought about the photograph on the top shelf of her bookcase, face down for 8 years. She thought about what it would mean to turn it face up. How small is small, she said. Adler almost smiled. It was a brief event. To start, 3 people. You'd have final say on the other 2. Advisory only initially. Initially, the scope expands as the protocol develops. Adler's eyes were steady. You'd retain your clinical credentials. This isn't a desk position. It's a field and oversight hybrid, the kind of role that doesn't exist yet, which is precisely why it needs someone who can build it from the inside out. Claire looked at the window for a moment, then back at Adler. I need 2 weeks, she said. I have some things to put in order. Take 3, Adler said. She left the coffee shop at 9:40 in the morning and walked back toward the parking structure where she'd left her car. And the day was cold in the clean way that November days were cold at altitude. Not brutal, just honest. The air, doing what air did at this elevation without apology for it. She passed a pharmacy, a dry cleaner, a small restaurant with its lunch menu written on a board outside. Ordinary infrastructure, the kind that existed everywhere and was noticed by almost no one. She thought about Grayson in a federal holding facility. About the way his face had looked in that basement corridor, the fear underneath the authority, the small and frightened thing that had been driving 14 months of suppression and betrayal. She did not feel sorry for him. She did not feel triumphant either. She felt the particular neutral clarity of a thing that had been wrong for a long time being corrected, which was not satisfying in the way movies suggested it would be, but was real in a way that movie satisfaction wasn't. She thought about Voss, somewhere in a federal cooperation debrief, trading names for reduced charges. About the calculation of that, the cost-benefit analysis of a person who had built her career on institutional authority, deciding that the institution was now less valuable than her own survival. Institutions were only as durable as the people who chose to uphold them. That was something she'd learned early and kept relearning. She thought about Ferris, whose cardiac event had resolved, and who was now in federal protective custody, preparing for testimony that would take 3 days minimum and cost him everything he'd built in the last decade, which had been built on a rotten foundation, but still, it was everything. She thought about what it cost a person to turn around in the middle of something wrong and start moving the other direction. It wasn't clean. It wasn't redemptive in any simple narrative sense. It was just a person who had done a bad thing deciding, at a specific moment, that they were going to stop doing it. That was more than a lot of people managed. She got to her car and sat in it without starting it for 5 minutes. She pulled out her phone and called a number she hadn't called in 3 years. It rang 4 times before it picked up, and the voice on the other end was her sister's. Older by 6 years, living in Portland, a civil engineer who had spent most of the last decade diplomatically not asking why Claire had gone so quiet. Hey, Claire said. A pause. Then carefully, Hey. I'm in Denver, Claire said. I wanted to call. Okay, her sister said. And then, after a moment, Are you okay? She thought about the question honestly. Her cheekbone hurt. She was tired in the molecular way of someone who had run on sustained adrenaline for 11 days. She was facing a conversation in 3 weeks about a role that didn't yet exist, building something from the inside out, which was exactly the kind of work she was built for, and which would be genuinely difficult, and would require things of her that sitting at a desk in a compliance archive had not required. I think so, she said. I'll know more in a few weeks. Claire. I know. Whatever happened, her sister said, I want to hear about it. When you're ready. Soon, she said. She meant it. She drove back to Ashbrook. She stopped at her apartment, went inside, and stood in the hallway for a moment in her coat. The apartment looked the same as it always looked. Functional, spare, the topographic map on the wall, the bookshelf with the manuals. She crossed to the bookshelf. She reached up to the top shelf and took the photograph down. She turned it over. It was a group photograph. 11 people in uniform, squinting against a desert sun, in front of a vehicle she didn't have a name she could say out loud. 3 of those people were gone. The rest were somewhere in the world, doing things she mostly didn't know about. She was in the back row, slightly taller than the person to her left, looking at the camera with the squinting directness of someone who has been in the sun for weeks and is not particularly interested in performing for the lens. She looked at it for a long time. Then she set it face up on the shelf where it belonged, where she could see it, and she went to make coffee. 14 days later, she drove back to Redstone Regional. Not because she had business there, she had no employment there, no access, no official reason to be in the building. She drove there because it was a Wednesday morning and she had made an appointment through the hospital's external liaison office to meet with the nursing staff on the 4th floor who had requested, through an internal letter signed by 11 nurses, a meeting with her. The letter had been organized by a nurse named Dana Kwan, who was 26 and had been at the hospital for 8 months and had, according to Priya, been one of the people most visibly affected by watching the previous 2 weeks unfold in real time. Claire met them in the 4th floor break room. 11 nurses of various ages and experience levels sitting around the tables with the particular attentiveness of people who have something real to say and are deciding how much to trust the space with it. Dana Kwan sat closest to the door, a notepad in her hands, her expression a careful combination of professional and something more personal than that. "We wanted to thank you," Dana said. "That's the official version. The real version is we have questions." "Okay," Claire said. "The medication flag on 412, Dana said. "The first night. You caught it in how long?" 30 seconds, maybe less. "Because you knew what to look for." "Because I've been reading medication interactions for 15 years. She looked at them. "You'll get there. All of you. But only if you trust what you see over what you're told to accept." She paused. "That's not anti-authority advice. That's clinical advice. Charts are tools. Your eyes are the primary instrument." A nurse near the window, late 30s, the look of someone who'd been at the hospital long enough to have watched a lot of things happen, said, "You knew something was wrong with the whole operation before you had evidence." "Yes." "How did you know?" Claire thought about that honestly. "Because I'd been kept small for a very specific reason. Incompetent people get kept small through neglect. That's disorganized. What happened to me was organized. Organized suppression has a pattern." She held the woman's gaze. "When what's done to you has a pattern, something is generating that pattern. You look for the source." The room was quiet for a moment. Dana Kwan was writing something on her notepad. She looked up. "Are you coming back? To nursing?" "Not here," Claire said. "But yes. In a different form." She didn't explain further because the form didn't fully exist yet, and she had 3 weeks to help build it. When she stood to leave, Dana stood too. "There's something else," she said. She held out a folded piece of paper. "This came through the hospital's external mail 2 days ago. Addressed to you, care of nursing staff. We didn't open it." Claire took it. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a military letterhead she recognized. 3 sentences. The first named her rank correctly, her restored rank, the one that had been expunged for 8 years. The second acknowledged what she had done and named it accurately, without flourish. The third was from the office of the Army's Surgeon General, and it read, "Your country has not forgotten what you did, even when it appeared to." She folded the paper carefully. She put it in her jacket pocket. She thanked them. She walked out of the break room, down the 4th floor corridor, past the nursing station where she had spent 3 years doing work that nobody credited, past the elevator bank, and down the stairs. She always took the stairs, through the lobby and out through the main doors into the cold Ashbrook air. She stood on the steps for a moment. The parking lot was ordinary. A few cars, a family walking toward the entrance, the parent carrying a child on one hip, a delivery driver unloading from a side vehicle. The mundane, continuous movement of a place where people came to be helped and usually were. There was a woman somewhere who had spent most of the last decade believing that the right way to survive an unjust system was to stay inside it and stay small and trust that smallness was a form of safety. That woman was not wrong about everything. Smallness had kept her inside the walls long enough to see the thing that needed to be seen, to be in the basement archive on a November morning when a compliance file didn't add up. Smallness had its uses, but it had never been who she was. It had been a costume she'd worn because the alternative, being fully and visibly what she was, had seemed for a very long time like a kind of exposure she couldn't survive. The photograph was face up on the shelf now. The people who had buried her report had names in a federal indictment. The man who had spent 3 years keeping her professionally invisible was sitting in a federal holding facility without his medical license and without his carefully constructed sense of authority, which was probably, for a man like him, the more significant loss. The woman who had signed his directives was cooperating with federal prosecutors and would spend the next several years watching everything she'd built disassemble around her in a way she would not be able to manage or spin or administratively restructure. And Claire was standing on the steps of a hospital that had once treated her like furniture, wearing her own coat and her own face, with a restored military record in a federal database and a letter in her pocket, and a meeting in 9 days with a woman named Adler, who wanted her to build something that didn't exist yet. She thought about the nurses in that break room, about Dana Kwan's notepad, and the careful, serious faces of people who had watched a thing happen and were trying to understand what it meant for them, what it meant about what they could do, what they were allowed to trust, how far their own judgment reached before the institution's authority overrode it. She thought about what she would have told herself, at 26, sitting in a room like that with a notepad and a question. Trust what you see. Document what you find. Do not mistake the silence of those around you for confirmation that nothing is wrong. Some of the most important things that have ever been done were done by people who had been told, in various forms and through various mechanisms, to stay exactly where they were and not look too closely at anything. The staying and the not looking are not virtues. They are habits, and habits can be examined and changed. She walked down the steps. She got in her car and started the engine and let it warm for 30 seconds, watching the Ashbrook morning through the windshield. Then she put it in drive and pulled out of the lot. She didn't look in the rearview mirror. Some things you walked away from facing forward, because the point was never where you'd been. The point was the direction of your feet and what you were going to build with the ground beneath them. She had survived 3 years of being treated like nothing. She had survived the longer years before that, the ones that had made her what she was. She knew how to read a chest that was concealing how badly it was hurt. She knew how to work inside a system that wasn't built for her. She knew how to find the thing that mattered inside a document that was designed to hide it. She knew how to stand in a room where everyone expected her to be smaller than she was, and to remain exactly what she was, and to wait for the moment when what she was turned out to be the only thing that mattered. The road out of the lot met the street, and she turned and drove into the rest of her life. Not triumphant, not unmarked, not without the weight of everything it had taken to get here, but forward, which was the only direction that had ever been worth anything, and moving, which was what she had always known how to do even in the years when it looked to everyone watching like she was standing still. The people who underestimate quiet women in scrubs never consider the possibility that the quiet is a choice and not a limitation.